Today we're going to be talking about a French model who may just make the best travel companion for the modern day businessman. These things are beautiful, man. These are a gorgeous pair of headphones. I love the coloration. I like their design styling when it's paired well with a good color match, and I really like this. To me, this might just be the prettiest headphone out today. It's just gorgeous. I think it looks amazing. The build though isn't just all looks. It does come with a carry case, as you may have seen in the unboxing ASMR video that I did. This is my favorite part of that video, by the way. This, unlike some of the other Focal headphones, only comes with one short single-ended cable, and it does seem to keep a lot of the bends. I don't love the actual cable portion, but honestly the splitter and the finishing connectors, like typical Focal, is very well made. I like the machining quality on all these, and again, the color match theme, it looks great. But I do wish this would come with a second longer cable for those who do want to use this at home. Now, the comfort is definitely there for what I would consider the typical head to be, but Focal is notoriously bad for fitting atypical heads. So if you have an odd-shaped head, you're probably used to things not fitting correctly, and you should get surgery. No, I'm just kidding. Just be aware. So Focal seems to change their headband materials and padding more often than Star Wars changes the lore. This is one of the softer headbands though of the Focals that I've tried. The Alex and the Clear both have stiffer headbands than this does. This is actually a very comfortable headband. Another thing I was worried about, since this is a closed back headphone and we're still in the months of the year that are basically aiming to melt your freaking face off, I was worried about temperature, but the temperature on this is actually very manageable, and I didn't feel like it had temperature issues at all, even compared to some open back headphones, which is great to see. Mileage is of course going to vary. Now, the replaceable ear pad quality is pretty good. The leather feels okay. It is not the best leather I've ever felt, but it's definitely not the worst either. It seems to fit in line with the rest of Focal's ear pads, which are generally pretty great. But before we talk about sound, we have to talk about amplification. See, this thing can be driven off of just about anything. You want to throw this on a phone or a laptop, it's going to sound fine. That doesn't mean you should though. This thing has an amazing property of being able to really absorb whatever sound quality of the amplifier you're throwing at it is. So while it sounds fine off of a phone, and while an average person would listen to this on a phone and probably have their mind blown, an audiophile may listen to this on their phone and may be a little bit less impressed. I would recommend a mobile amplifier, at least something like a Moondrop Moonriver 2 that I just reviewed the other day. That would be a great USB-C, very small, compact travel companion for this that would just go in the case. That would be amazing. The reason why I'm saying this is because this headphone is amazingly flexible in terms of sound difference depending on the amplifier. This can sound one way on one amp and a completely different way on another amp, and it's almost like two different headphones. It can get kind of wild, especially when you throw in a mix like tubes or something like that. So 500 years later, I arrived to the point, and the reason why I'm telling you this is because when I talk about any component, it really depends on what amplifier you're listening to. So if it's bass, mid-range, or treble, you can get different experiences on every amp. And I'm specifying this because not every headphone, especially not every closed back headphone, acts like this, but this one does. The best bass that I got out of this thing was out of the 11 Audio Broadway. That had a phenomenally fast but deep and hard-hitting bass response. I would consider the average aggregate performance of this on different amplifiers and on phones, stuff like that, is a punchy bass without being super bloated though. It has a tiny bit of bass bleed, but for a bassier closed back headphone, that is just going to be the price that you pay. And I'm more judging the bass bleed quality off of the price point, even though it's very expensive at $1,000. Other closed back headphones around about this price are not perfect here either, and usually they compromise either too little bass or too much. Now, you can control this bass with good amplification like that Broadway, but some amplifiers have a tendency to let it be a little bit too loose for my preferences. But on the right amp, this actually sounds very high quality. Now, speaking of that Broadway, it is a balanced amplifier, which means that you need a balanced cable to run with this. If you do buy this headphone from Oppos, which is actually who sent this out, so thank you a lot, Oppos, they are selling it with a free Oppos Flow cable, which you can get in XLR or a couple other terminations that might actually give you a second cable that is even longer than the one it comes with. So that would be a good workaround of getting a second cable without spending any more money. Now, bass response on a laptop or a phone is got some less desirable properties. It's a little bit less forward than some people may absolutely prefer. And of course, it's going to vary depending on what phone you're using and what laptop you're using. But I was judging this off of the new 16-inch MacBook Pro with the high impedance headphone jack. I did test for driver excursion limits, which have been a problem with something like the Alex in the past for me, as the driver would hit the limit of how far it could travel and it would make a popping sound. I think because of the closeback properties having kind of a different chamber pressure, making it much more difficult for it to fully extend its full travel distance, I never had any excursion limits with this thing. Mid-range is both good and bad for me. Compared to their open back brothers and sisters in the Focal line, the mid-range is not quite as good as something like a Clear or a Clear MG. It's also not quite as good as something like an Alex. Now, those are very, very good mid-range headphones. So it's kind of a high bar to set, but if you're comparing against those, you might be a little bit disappointed. Though, again, you see that amplifier argument come in all day long. This has sort of a thinner shift to it on a solid state amplifier, even something like that Broadway or the new topping A90D. This doesn't sound super fulfilled, especially in the timbre regions and the harmonic properties that a voice can really have. This doesn't really bring that out a whole lot. It's not very easy for it to bring out. However, on something like a dark voice or the X-Duo TA26, which is what I'm using, which is basically a dark voice copy, the timbre properties are exceptional and it really brings out the mid-range a lot and makes this headphone very, very enjoyable to listen to. But if you listen primarily on solid states, you may not like the mid-range as much. It does seem a little bit dry for tonality. Now, treble response is an area that I was a little bit worried about because people say that this headphone is a little bit dark in the treble response, and it is, but it's also detailed. It's like, it's got this ability to seem both fast, but not overly bright. And I like that. I'm very sensitive to bright headphones personally, and I would much rather have a headphone be a little bit dark than a little bit bright. And closeback headphones honestly have a tendency to basically just be a compromise of either design. I've never come across a closeback headphone that had perfect treble response. They are either too sharp in some areas or too dark in some areas, and I'd rather take the slightly darker sound signature. This, like breaking up with my first love, was more about dealing with reality and less about trying to shoot for something that's never going to happen. It still hurts. Now, similar to what I imagine it's like to fight Khabib, there's one thing that you just can't get away from. Soundstaging is the biggest downside to this thing, I think. It's the weakest component. Most of the sounds really feel like they're coming from right here. This is not a very wide headphone in general. Now, it's got enough separation between the vocalist and the background instruments to create a well-defined image. And the imaging is fantastic, but the sound staging is just not great. Now, this mixed with the frequency response properties makes this headphone really, really good for some music and a little bit lackluster for others. So if you're listening to modern rock, pop, R&B, soul, anything like that, the modern stuff, this headphone plays really well with, honestly. It sounds great. It sounds punchy. It feels alive. Everything kind of feels like present and part of the music. And with wider soundstaging headphones, sometimes you just get this feeling that not everything has quite the presence that it really needs to have. Though things like soundtracks or soundstage focused performances like orchestral performances are a little bit lacking in terms of the scale department on this headphone. But after speaking with a lot of people, while it may not be the classic audiophile decision, I think a lot of people don't necessarily think too much about soundstage, and they prefer things that just have good dynamic slam in the bass response and have a detailed enough treble response to come across as fairly high fidelity, which this does. It's just not an overly detailed analytical headphone. Now, if you're listening primarily at home or in a quiet environment, I would highly recommend something like the Focal Alex or the Focal Clear instead. I think those are phenomenal open back headphones, so they allow sound to travel out from the headphone and the outer world sound to travel into the headphone. But they're better headphones in my opinion. They have better mid-range response. They're a little bit more detailed in the treble response. Bass depends on how much bass you like. In terms of which one you might like, those might seem a little thin to some users, and this may seem a little excessive to some users. So Just depends on who you are. A lot of people throw a lot of hate because it's not a super detailed technical headphone, but I don't think every user is looking for that. If you are, this isn't the headphone for you. But if you are somebody who prefers a little bit more of a fun sound signature that still has a little bit of that luxurious high fidelity sound added to it, that's kind of what this is. All right, guys, that's going to be it. Thanks a lot for watching. See you guys next time. Bye.